Hello, DLU delicious people. I'm here today to review Parallel. You can't go back, but you probably can. So, I wanted to check out this movie. I know probably it'll probably be a thing that no one might care about, but I went into apps like Vudu and whatever to just kind of see like kind of an interesting film, and I ended up winding up into a movie called Parallel. So check this movie out. It's free on Vudu, VUDU, or you can probably go like supposedly it weirdly said Tubi, but there's a lot of times where I'll check on Tubi and it'll be some other version of the same film because evidently Google can't understand that at points in time. So if it's on Parallel, if Parallel is also on Tubi, like go and check that out first if you've already downloaded Tubi. If not, then go on to Vudu, VUDU, and eventually watch this for free because I know that for sure that it's on Vudu, VUDU. Or you can go and just download Tubi for the heck of it, so that way you can go and watch a bunch of content for free without any kind of fees of any kind. So, Parallel. Uh, Really, I would say for this film, like I think it's a really good concept. I enjoy it up until a certain point where it just decides to get very confusing, and then you just don't know what jumble of a mess is kind of going on towards more of the end of the film. And then you just have to just kind of settle with whatever end product of this movie that it decides to deliver to you. I would say I enjoy this film, but because like there was something smart about it, but then eventually it just kind of breaks into this weird chaos of which that I don't quite 100% understand. And then so I'm just left with just going like, well, okay, like whatever happens with in this film, like we just get jumble messes of people from a alternate world, but only at an alternate world during a certain time period, which I find weird. So let's see it up. What is this movie about? So it seems that eventually there is to be a group of people. There's someone who eventually discovers this too, but eventually they figure out a way to kind of conceal it from the rest of the world. But coincidentally, these people end up moving into this old lady's house to eventually stumble upon this room where they stumble upon this mirror where eventually they are to walk into this alternate world. Coincidentally, an alternate world that is to be during a certain time loop. So, which means that every time that these people are to exit out of this alternate world and re enter back into the world, everything is to reset. So basically, they could go into this alternate world, murder 30 people, go back to their world, and then come back to this one, and nobody had said that, oh, like, they're murderers. So it's like a weird parallel dimension time loop of a thing where it also seems if they go to this alternate world and do X amount of days of work, I guess it doesn't count against this world that they are in. So it's just kind of weird, like a dimensional time bubble of a thing where like somebody will do 5 days of work in the other universe to come back to the alternate one that they actually are from and can get things done fairly quickly. So I thought that was really interesting. But eventually these people are also real highly intelligent people. So eventually they figure out a way to take advantage of this alternate world and to steal things from it, which I thought was really smart and really brilliant. And I was like, oh my god, so you're basically stealing, copying, and pasting from somebody who made a huge success in the other world to use that content to eventually bring that to this world and and then that's how you're going to make your money. I'm like, wouldn't it be interesting to have eventually, because like here's how they immediately come up with the idea, because it seems like there is some alternate movie in this world compared to this one, and so they're like, oh my god, like here's how we can really make our money, here's how we can really just cash in. And so eventually they really just start to like corner some market of trying to steal like technologies, or trying to eventually take uh, certain kind of artistry or just certain ideas from people and make it their own, and then they make a butt ton of money. And so yeah, so then eventually people, when going to this alternate world, eventually make mistakes, and eventually they pay for them. And so like that's kind of how the movie kind of pays out in a nutshell. It's really interesting. So it's not really like a time looping, it's not anything to do with time travel. It just has to do with a other dimension hopping thing, where it seems like time in either one of these things has no real true value when a person is to figure out how to hop between these multiverses, or whichever. So yeah, it's a really interesting movie. I thought it was better than I thought it was going to be. But then again, like the way that the ending of this movie just kind of plays out just gets so murky and so confused. Or I'm so confused with, I'm thinking like, okay, so who is really who in this movie? Who is what in this film? What is going on? Why is it all of a sudden they have laser guns in this film? What? I'm so confused. So going into this, let's go into that double 5 times spoiler territory, because it's customary time again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time again to spoil this movie. So before we go into absolute spoilers, I would say that this is a good enough movie. Uh, Really, because all that murky stuff kind of at the end, it kind of like they don't have to, I guess, rationalize or whatever, like the whole portal hopping thing. They just say, well, portal hopping, and like through a mirror, and we're just having to just buy into that. Yeah, interesting. Kind of reminds me too much of Sliders, but Sliders in the fact that you can keep going into one other world and whatever. Like, it's Sliders, but it's not Sliders. If anybody remembers the show Sliders. If you don't, there's probably a trailer that probably exists somewhere of that show. So let's go into it. Let's go into spoilers now. So, very beginning of the film, we have this woman who is to be called Marissa. And so, in the beginning of the film, Marissa is to eventually, from the alternate world, come to this world and eventually break into this woman's house, supposedly, even though she probably has the key and everything like that. Marissa goes and is to try and grab her alternate world Marissa, and so Marissa is thinking she's getting robbed, but Marissa is just to rob herself of her own life, to switch places with her, so I guess she can live with her husband, because I guess in maybe her world, her husband died, and so she had just decided to just swap places with this person because maybe things in her life didn't go her way in the alternate world. I don't know. I don't know how that perfectly worked out. So eventually, years are to pass, and supposedly this new group of people end up moving into this home. And so it seems like these people are to be struggling, people that are wanting to come up with this brand new app. That they're like, hey man, like, all we need is about like X amount of weeks from now, and the guy's like, well, like I need you to come up with this in X amount of days from now. And they're like, we can't do that. Like, there's no way that that can possibly happen. So they're like, well, hey, like, we have another guy who can tell us that he can put this together and you can't. And so we have both. We have both Noel and Devin who ends up kind of confronting the Seth guy, just like, hey man, like, because it seemed that Seth kind of took advantage of. I guess he ended up working with these people, and then he decided to bail to eventually try to make his own company where he could make some real legitimate money, but steal all their ideas. So, and if he was to make this thing and put it out there quicker, then that's basically the way of which that like this guy was going to steal everything from out from under these people without them realizing it. So, so what eventually ends up happening is that these people are like, well, I guess Seth is just gonna come up with this thing. Like basically, like we've already, like I guess we're just gonna like lose this whole company idea that we're gonna put together because there's no way it's going to work. And so we start having Devin kind of thinking of other jobs that he can probably jump onto, and Noel is like, dude, you're thinking that this is a sinking ship and you're gonna bail out on us. It's like, well, yeah, it's like this is just not making any money anymore. So, so what eventually ends up happening with the frustration of these people is that one guy is to just chuck something into a wall, and all of a sudden he ends up breaking the wall, and all of a sudden, like Lena is just to be like, well, like I guess we lost our security deposit in this building. Man, I guess that sucks. And but all of a sudden they end up seeing this like weird kind of staircase that they didn't see before, and so Noel is to just tell Lena, it's like, well, hey, we've already lost the security deposit of this building, probably anyways. So how about we just rip up this wall to see what's behind it because this does not seem right. So all of a sudden they end up ripping up this wall to eventually find it's to have a staircase behind it, which is to lead to a I guess attic in this building. So or an attic in this home. So they go upstairs and basically they end up finding out that Marissa had been bizarrely taking pictures of supposedly her alternate version of herself, but they think that the woman took some pictures of her own twin and was trying to figure things out. So like as if she was trying to like watch over her for whatever reason because there were so many pictures of this exact same woman, like this girl is following her. So eventually more and more they just find like these things creepy where all of a sudden there's two different books that have slightly different writing that are in them, and so it seems like someone was trying to do research on their alternate person. So what ends up happening is eventually the guys are kind of messing around, and eventually Devin is to land his hand outside this mirror, or so he's like inside the mirror, and like he slips his hand into it, and so now we end up having people who realize like, oh my god, like there must be some weird portal here from another world, something like that. So they just start feeling around like through the mirror, and eventually one of the people take a cell phone and kind of pop it out of the like onto the alternate world to see what it looks like. And they're like, okay, so like over here, like over on this alternate world, it seems that uh, reasonably it's the same building as we are in, but like uh like it's just like it looks like a certain shade. Like I guess when you're in this yellow world, it's the normal world, but when it shows blue, I guess you're in the other alternate world. So it kind of helps you figure out what is the difference between alternate worlds. So we finally have one person who's just like, hey man, like let's just go and test and see if this is like breathable air and whatever. So one guy just rushes through the mirror and is to seemingly be fine, and then he ends up coming back. And so all of a sudden, two people go through the mirror and realize that they didn't come in there together. So they go back, and so then they hold hands and go through the mirror together, and they end up coming back seemingly at the same time. So they're like, okay, so we figured it out that like if we want to all come back together, if everything needs to come together, then like we need to just do that. So the first plan of attack for them to do was to go and take all of their items into this place that I guess the other people don't realize. Because evidently the other them don't realize that they are there. Because we end up just seeing these people eventually kind of going through their day to day, not knowing that there's an alternate portal in their universe. So these people just start taking advantage of it. Basically, we have two guys that are otherwise putting together this app on the alternate world and eventually putting the pieces together so that way they can come back to their world in like a day and have the app done much quicker than that other guy is. So it's like, hey man, our app is done now. So how about you fork over the dough to like say that we are to have our thing up and running. And so then they're like, okay, this sounds great. So all of a sudden, so eventually they decide to go to the alternate world and find out that it's like a time looping kind of thing. And so they realize that they can go and steal the wallet of their other person or collect a massive number of credit card debt onto the other person without them like getting any of the consequences of all this. Because really, it's basically like steal the credit card, run this person's credit card up, go back to the other dimension, come back, and like their credit card debt doesn't exist. They can steal the credit card again, run up the credit card again, steal the same money from this guy's wallet over and over and over and over again, and it'll never count against their double. So like one day they can have as much fun as humanly possible, and it doesn't count against them or their double seemingly, because I guess the double doesn't get the consequences of what's going on here, because I guess they're just stuck in a loop for whatever day. So all of a sudden this entire group gets like filthy stinking rich, and we had one guy with a plan who desperately just wanted to go and take $1 million and just explode it. So what they end up doing in this alternate world is we end up having the two guys, both Josh and Noel, who go with a old fashioned stick of dynamite and toss it into a big bag of money, and they just burn it up and just explodes. And so while they're both weirdly looking like the Godfather for whatever reason, uh, and they're kind of trying to do the lines from the Godfather, so all of a sudden they're hiding behind some dumpster, and all of a sudden they end up finding out a copy of supposedly a movie that Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling did called Frankenstein. and they're like, wait a minute, like our world never did like a movie called Frankenstein with Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling. Like this seems weird. And so they're like, "Oh my god, like this is a way we could take advantage of this world is by finding technology or finding artistry or finding some kind of thing that we can copy paste and steal from them because they have the technology and we don't coincidentally because somebody thought of a different route about something where we couldn't, and so we're just going to steal all of their ideas and bring it here, manufacture it here, and copy, steal, and paste from them. So all of a sudden, like at first, we end up having Lena, who is to find this like amazing painter in their world. And evidently, she finds out that Mona Lisa's hair is much shorter in their world for whatever reason. So uh, so what ends up happening is that uh, Lena goes and takes this kind of artistry with these like skulls or something like that, and brings it to some art person, and she's like, "Oh my God, these paintings are magnificent!" And so I desperately need you to go and have an art show, like showing all these off, while Lena is just basically like copying and pasting from all these pictures that she took from the internet from the alternate universe to just have this like highbrow art thing going on. And so Lena eventually is to also show one of her pictures that she just did herself, and no one gives about that. No one cares about that. And so Lena is just so frustrated that basically the only way that she can make money and the only way she can be good at being an artist is basically being a fraud. So she gets freaking just frustrated about it. And so Noel is looking at how they can, in the best way possible, rip off this world. And Devin is just like, well, you know what? Like, isn't that like a horrible thing to do? Like, come on, man. Like, how about like we just not completely take advantage of this? Like, yeah, it's kind of fun to see alternate things, but like you're going too far, kind of thing. So anyways, so both Devin and Josh decide to go through the portal one day, and Josh is to eventually, finally, get with the girl that he's always wanted, and so because there's only so many times that Josh can try to hit on this girl in his world and it not work out. So Josh ends up going to alternate world where coincidentally, I guess it does work out because I think he ends up using like the groundhog gimmick, where I think he probably finds out like certain things that this girl likes, and then eventually uses it against her, so that way he can sleep with her, and then and so on and so forth. So Devin is to eventually kind of listen to some kind of music and do something on his computer because he's trying to look up like what's going on with his dad because eventually Devin is to go to this alternate world and to honestly just say like a real legitimate goodbye to his father, um, because Devin in his world Devin's father had killed himself, and so Devin wants to go to this world where his where his father is still alive because he was just caught just in the nick of time before taking his own life, and he went off to prison. And so Devin is to kind of apologize to his father about what he had said, but Devin is also just like, man, if only I would have said something sooner. Like maybe this all would have been prevented, or maybe you would have stopped doing what you did. So but anyways, so but that happens later. So Josh is going and making out with this woman. Devin is to just kind of be waiting in this room, kind of not really uh, kind of knowing what's going on in the background. All of a sudden, it seems that Joshua's girlfriend is to have seemingly some husband coming home to eventually understand what the heck is going on. Because I guess this woman is to have a man in this alternate world. So all of a sudden, both Josh and Devin are running back to their alternate world because Josh is now shot. And so he's bleeding to death. And no matter what they're doing, he's just going to bleed out. And so Devin tells Noel to call for the cops, but Noel doesn't do that because he's like, dude, I just want him to bleed to death. Because, like, how are we going to explain this bullet that is untraceable? And, like, how are we going to explain any of this? So, Noel's plan is just to kidnap alternate Josh and to like switch places, like have the dead body of Josh chucked into this other world because it won't matter then, and to just have reasonably just this Josh like wake up one day and not realize that his world is different, but eventually Josh will start putting together the pieces slowly but surely. Because eventually he'll go on to his Facebook feed and eventually he'll realize, like, hey, like, one friend that I had when I was much younger, like, he always had red hair. Now his hair was always green. This makes no sense. And so eventually Josh is to have some book that he read as a kid that was always spelled a certain way. Now it's spelled different, and so on and so forth. There were so many pictures of stuff that he ended up taking that he didn't remember even doing any number of those pictures, or being with certain number of girlfriends, or whatever. So eventually Josh starts putting the pieces together, that this must be some alternate world, and eventually Josh is starting to lose his freaking mind. So now that I've gotten to most of those parts, so Leanna is at this art show where eventually Devin is to show up to just try to be a good friend. And so eventually Lena is to eventually mention that she's a fraud and she's just so ticked off that no one's going to like her own painting and she probably won't be able to even sell it. So Devin is just to help her to get out of here because obviously Lena is drunk and she might spill some kind of secret. So Devin was also at some point to go after speaking with his father. Eventually Devin was to go and talk to Noel and mention like how is it that they got so far apart from one another, and because they used to be such good friends and they're kind of reminiscing about old times and whatever. So Lena eventually is to go home with Devin, and Devin is to mention that he had gone to Lena's very first art showing and that he has always ever loved her. And so Lena ends up going and sleeping with Devin. And so what ends up happening is Josh eventually is to confront Noel and to eventually just say like, hey man, like this doesn't seem right, like this isn't my right world and whatever. And so eventually Noel just explains this to Josh to like explain the whole parallel world thing and just like explain everything to him. And so what ends up happening is Josh ends up shooting Noel, and an alternate Noel ends up coming back. And I guess this Noel was the one from the other world where... So Noel had talked to the other Noel of this world and brought him back, I guess, as an insurance policy if he was to ever get killed because he was assuming that someone was going to double cross him soon, and why not have a spare Noel on hand? So, so he's kind of like prestiging it right now, where he's like consistently making clones of himself and killing his clones off whenever like the pure or the legitimate clone is to come back. Like, so he's basically like Hugh Jackman from Prestige, where he probably repetitiously kills the own clone version of himself off and chucks it back into the other world, I'm assuming. So, what ends up happening is that uh, Leanna kind of walks in as like or Josh is to be dead, an alternate version Noel is to be dead, and Noel is to come in there with a laser gun, and he is to explain their like this alternate world is really advancing in technology to the point where Noel has stolen this creation of this seemingly plastic paper that like I guess you can kind of crumble it and it reforms, and eventually you can kind of tap this plastic paper and it copies everything that's on that paper onto this plastic paper. So it's kind of like a weird, interesting invention. And so, I don't know the whole breakdown of it, the scientific part of it, but eventually then Noel is to mention to Leanna about like other advancements that this other world has gone into where they've come up with this anti-gravity kind of thing. So it's going to be a huge massive experiment that they figured out that they couldn't. And so he's like, yeah, we can take advantage of this too, we can steal this too, and say that we came up with this idea. And Lena's like, when is this gonna stop? Like, when is enough enough? Like, how much can we really have just copied and pasted and stolen from this alternate world and claim that it's our idea? Like, this just seems wrong that we're going and doing this. Especially like people are going to eventually start to question how is it that these people can come up with these ideas when they might not really legitimately have the true legitimate uh, like education behind any on a number of these things, or how are they going to have like a skill that has been mastered over a certain number of years that all of a sudden they end up getting to this point where it's like, oh yeah, I can see where like eventually like when you probably look at Mozart or something like that, eventually he had a bunch of trials until he made it to his Ninth Symphony, or like eventually there was like certain kind of big huge artists like Picasso's and whatever, they had a billion rough drafts until they stumbled upon their one thing that made them hugely massively successful. And whatever, like there has to have been like a trail coming from a certain kind of thing, but I guess not for these people. So so what ends up happening is Noel is to have this laser gun that that he brings back from the other world. And so basically Lena feels terrified because like Noel has this laser gun, and so he's just like telling her that he really loves her and that he had tried several times to confess his love to this alternate Leanna, but it seemed like they didn't have the perfect smile like Leanna has here. So, in other words, it didn't really work out the relationship in that world, and so it wasn't going to eventually work out here also. It just was never going to work out. So, Leanna eventually tries to grab the gun from Noel, tries to shoot him, and Noel's like, ha 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 ha, like, you need a fingerprint of mine to have this thing work, so you can't shoot me. So, Leanna just takes the gun and runs off to Devon's place, and so Leanna is to mention what all is going on, and Devin doesn't really understand because he's alternate world Devin, because evidently Leon was to realize that eventually Devin was just going to get in his way. And so Noel I guess, had killed Devin from this world to eventually grab Devin from this other world and to just kind of switch things over. So eventually, what ends up happening forcibly is Lena is to just be like, well, like, there's no way for me to really just, like, help this Devin understand. And so she ends up going back to the house, trying to figure out, like, how they're going to finally stop this whole universe hopping and taking advantage of it. They just need to stop it. Like, it's going to get too outrageous because Noel is to think that he's going to buy the whole, like, basically buy the whole, uh, like neighborhood that they're in, so that way no one could ever figure out like what's going on. And I guess they have like $40 million to just blow, so I guess they're just going to buy up every single building that's around them, so no one will know the difference about what's really going on here. No one will get suspicious or figure it out or just be like, hey, why does this guy have so much money? Because eventually he'll just buy up the whole neighborhood. So uh, so eventually, what ends up happening is Lana goes back to this place, and eventually, what ends up happening is that Devin eventually comes back and shoots Noel. Um, and eventually, Noel goes back to the other universe to, I guess, heal up and then come back to this world all healed. And so by that time, Lena ends up going and breaking the mirror, or she ends up tilting the mirror slightly to where all of a sudden, like, no one can teleport anymore. And so Noel is to come like in back into this other world halfway through. And so all of a sudden, like, now his body is like chopped in half, and like the front half of his body just kind of falls over. And so now I think what they end up doing is they end up just chucking Noel's body back through the other world because it doesn't matter anyways. And then they just completely break the mirror so no one can come through this alternate world anymore. And so they're like, okay, well, how about this? How about we just run off together, and like we run off with all this money, and like we just create a new world for ourselves. Because eventually Devin was to mention Noel that certain people were going to get certain payoffs regardless. So yeah, so they just decide to just run off together. So all of a sudden, Leona is to go into this one gas station and eventually look into this mirror. And so all of a sudden, there is to be, I guess, this mirror who creates this alternate version of Lena, who comes back from this gas station and is to just go right through and to talk to Devin. And so Devin is like, well, hey, like, what music should we listen to? And she's like, oh, we should listen to this. And he's like, didn't we just already listen to that? And she's like, oh, yeah, I completely forgot. So you can tell it's alternate world Lena. We also had the moment where Devin was to not really understand what Lena was talking about, but then evidently Devin kind of planned this out to where if there was anything that was going to happen to him, he would have a video queued up for his other self that explains everything about, like, hey, like, if you're listening to this, I'm probably dead and you're an alternate version of me. And so, like, if you're watching this, you're an alternate version of me, and I can rationalize and explain all of that. Um, so, yeah, in a nutshell, that's what all really happens in the movie. uh, probably explaining that one thing that happened earlier. They find out if they adjust the mirror part, it seems like they can't go through the into the other universe, but so they have to set the mirror up a certain way to go into the other universe. That's where I was saying where they were trying to adjust the mirror to eventually have Noel just have like half of his body just be like chopped in half, um, because they adjusted the mirror just in time for him to walk through, and half of his body came through, and so he ended up dying. So yeah, with that said, I think I've explained everything. Good enough movie, but who knows? A lot of people might just think that this movie is a weird concept of film, whatever. Completely understand that. But with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.